Many of you probably know Barry McGaw. He's currently directing the writing of the national curriculum. In a previous role, he was a Director of Education for the OECD. When he was there, he did some research about what influences students' educational attainment. And from that work, he's identified that 40% of the influence is from a student's individual social background, 30% is from their average social background that they come from, and 30% relates to the quality of the teaching they receive when they're in school. So in sum, 70% of the influence on your students' educational attainment comes from something other than the quality teaching. Another reason is, I think, we often think about schooling as now I'm not saying you, but I think in general there is a tendency to think about schooling as being disconnected from its community. It's almost like when you walk through the school gate, you're in a different world. And I know that some teachers say things like, with all good intentions to try and be fair, they'll say to you, well, when they walk into my classroom, I forget about what's happened in their life, I treat them all the same. Now, that sameness is actually doing them a disservice. It's actually understanding where they come from and the influences that are on their lives that we really need to engage with. That notion of fairness is actually a disservice to those students. And I think the third reason that we kind of forget about context is because we don't understand it. We don't understand the social backgrounds. They're quite different from our own. A couple of people today have talked about their own backgrounds when they were growing up and where they came from. Even so, those places are different places now. I mean, I share that history as well. But my experience of growing up in a very low socioeconomic background is quite different from what it means to grow up in one today. So our own personal experiences, we've got to be careful we don't generalise that across all of these students we come in contact. We do need to know about what are the things that they're confronting. And that requires us to do some research, to be researchers, and not just simply to understand and recognise, but also to value. Those communities have rich resources that can be drawn on in our schools. We need to research what are the funds of knowledge in these communities that we can draw on, both in terms of the curricula that we develop and the pedagogies that we develop in those schools. So I think there's some of the reasons why context is left out and why it's so important. We're talking about 70% of the influence on those students. If we're able to make a connection between those contexts of those students and what they do in school, so that it's not a foreign place they walk into every morning, it's a place that actually takes into account who they are and makes those connections, we can really build on those contexts and not see them as some sort of deficit.